Welcome to the AI+HI project. I'm Alex Alonso, Chief Data and Insights Officer at SHRM. Thanks for joining us today. Each week, we sit with visionaries from the world of business, tech, and HR to provide you with deep insights, actionable strategies, and practical advice for harnessing the transformative potential of artificial intelligence, or AI as we all know it, combined with human intelligence, and in my case, sometimes human ingenuity as well. This week, we're exploring the need for ethics, transparency, and accountability when using AI for recruitment as well as for performance management. This is particularly relevant for us as we've seen great investments across the board in a variety of different startups, different technologies focused primarily on these two areas, especially in the space of HR. Our guest this week is Hilke Schellmann, author of the book, The Algorithm: How AI Decides Who Gets Hired, Monitored, Promoted, and Fired, and Why We Need to Fight Back Now. I can't wait to hear what you have to say, Hilke. It's something that is particularly telling for me and something that's really close to my heart as an industrial organizational psychologist. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited.
For those of you that don't know, Hilke is also an assistant professor of journalism at NYU, as well as an Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist. But one of the things that stands out is I'd love to hear a little bit more about the focus of your research, the kind of reporting that you do. I mentioned in some of our pre-work that I'm a big fan of your work, having watched Outlawed and a variety of other things that you've done. What compelled you to write the book, The Algorithm?
I think I asked myself that many times while I was writing it. But I think it started in November 2017, so it's been a while. Where I was at a conference in Washington D.C. that had nothing to do with AI or HR. It was a consumer lawyer conference, and I needed a ride back to the train station, take a train to New York, and as one does, I called myself a Lyft, or a ride share. Got in the back seat, started chatting with the driver, and just asked him, like, how was your day? And he was like, I had a weird day. And then the history of me taking ride shares, that has never happened. I take them somewhat a lot because I live in New York and I have a car. And I was like, so what happened? And he told me that he had a job interview with a robot. He had applied to a baggage handler position at a local airport, and he got a call from a robot that day on his phone asking him 3 questions. I had never heard about robots doing job interviews, and I was really interested, and I made a note, and kind of forgot about it until a few months later. My colleague Meredith Broussard dragged me to an AI conference. I wasn't covering AI at the time. I really didn't have much of an interest, but there was someone who had just left the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission giving a talk, and she said, she can't sleep at night because companies use very basic algorithm to go through people's calendars to understand, how many hours they're absent. And she was really worried that people who have a disability, mothers, or, people, employees with caregiving obligations, might get reprimanded or terminated because they have longer absentee times, and they're protected under the law. So we started talking. She told me about some other companies and how, AI is moving into hiring. I went to PsyOp, I went to HR Tech, and I was just blown away by what I was seeing. And I was like, wow, this seems to be really moving into this industry. And I was looking around. I was like, I haven't really seen a lot of journalism about this. Seems to be a really seismic shift in the industry.
A lot of people think about it in terms of sort of something that's been taking off since 2023, right? Because everyone thinks of what we think of as really ChatGPT,
yeah, totally,
right? But in reality, it's been in our field and really machine scoring, all the different types of machine learning that we know about. They've been around for almost 20, 30 years in some cases, some even going back to 1952. I'd love to kind of get your reaction to, you're right, that is something that warranted a book in many ways. And I'd love to get your reaction to this notion of what it is that people don't know. Particular, that stands out to me as far as what is it that's happening? What is it that's out there in terms of the space? And not just from the candidate perspective and the applicant perspective, but also even from the employer perspective, to your point.
Yeah. I mean, I think, maybe not very surprising to a lot of people. I talk to a lot of job seekers, and they're really unaware how much AI is being used. I mean, some folks do know that AI is being used, and they sort of, now that they have ChatGPT and generated by AI, they sort of joke about that they, use ChatGPT to help them polish their resume and their cover letter, and they use it to train for one-way video interviews. They sort of joke about it, AI against AI, but like most people that I talk to, on the job seeker side had no idea that AI is being used on them, right? They didn't know that there's resume screeners or resume parsers, that like all the big job platforms use some form of AI, right? When I talked to folks who had applied, they thought a human watches it. So we see like there's a real disconnect, right? The job seekers have no idea, and I'm sure it's somewhere in the fine print. But job seekers, they just want the job so desperately. They're going to click on it and play the game or do the video interview, and they don't know how it's going to be analyzed and scored. They just hope they will make it into the next round. But I think also what employers may not be aware of, which I found kind of quite striking, that like, when we use deep neural networks, which we often use in predictive AI, and it doesn't really matter what that is, but what is helpful to think about is like we have the training data and we have the results, but we don't necessarily know exactly what the computer scores on. That's happening in the deep neural networks. So I think what was interesting to me is that the vendors often actually don't know exactly what the system score candidates on. And, and I think employers, they buy these tools and they hear, wonderful marketing messages that this is like going to democratize hiring and SPY is free, and it's going to find the most qualified candidates. We're going to make hiring more efficient. They're going to save a lot of money. I think it makes it way more efficient. It saves them a lot of money. But I found like so many instances of possible discrimination and instances of like, I don't really have any evidence that the tools pick the most qualified candidates. And in fact, from surveys of C-suite leadership, we know that if a company uses AI, about 90% in a survey of over 2,000 C-suite leadership folks, they said they know that their tools reject qualified candidates. So I think we kind of know that these AI tools are not as working as well as we thought they would be, or that was the hope. And I do think that like, this is like from the research I've done, I think that humans are also very biased. I'm not advocating to like go back to the old days of like human hiring, right? Like, but I feel like this is like the first generation of AI tools that we have seen, and we sort of just seem like we have automated a lot of, processes that were not quite working in the old days either. So now we automated them, and it's really not working because the problems of the past we just replicated now in a much larger scope. And I think that's where the problem lies. If there's a problem with that tool, it could discriminate against tens of thousands or hundreds of thousand applicants, right? Like, and I think we know, like most employers know, I getting inundated by resumes, right? They get so many applications, they don't know how to do it. So they need these kinds of tools. But I think they need to be really aware and understand what goes inside the tools. And I think it's quite striking that the developers often don't know themselves what goes inside of these tools, which I think is different from what IO psychologists did before, right? Like with the regression analysis, you kind of knew the inputs and you kind of knew what was happening. And that's now a little different.
To your point, that's fascinating that you mentioned that, because in the past, right, the algorithm was known, and it was to refine it with as few variables as possible so that we got to the point where we understood where the variance in high, or the variability in hiring, really kind of existed, right? I think a little bit about, because there's an example that comes to mind from your book, and I'm going to dive into recruiting and hiring and retention and all the various processes. But the example that comes to mind is from chapter 4. And I think about Alex, the young credit analyst, who really spoke to one of the things that he was finding was he just wasn't getting job offers. He wasn't even being invited to come back, right? One of the things that stands out to me, though, was he was actually, he classified himself as a people person, which is atypical, right? In many cases, if you were to think about the personality traits and or the various things that go into what is your typical financial analyst or credit analyst, right? So in many ways, what I found particularly interesting about that example was things that would be differentiators were actually differentiators, but in a way that kept him from being included in searches as opposed to including him in
Yeah.
searches?
I mean, we don't know exactly, right? And I would never say that I know exactly why Alex didn't make it to the next
Sure,
round,
sure.
right? Because I'm not inside the algorithms. But what strikes me as difficult is that a lot of the AI tools are not based on a job analysis first to understand what are the skills, capabilities, and maybe experience that you need to be successful in this job, right? It takes whatever information we can gather about the people currently in the role. In this case, with Alex, he was doing higher view video interviews, and at the time, this was in 2018. I was working on a story for the Wall Street Journal. Higher view was still using in their AI tool emotion recognition software and intonational voice analysis. And, at first I was like, oh, it seems really interesting. Like maybe, the machines are better than we are. And they found something about facial expressions that we humans had no idea is inferring, like is predictive of success in the job. Well, it turns out there's really no science underneath this, right? Like there is no facial expression or there is no science what facial expressions I should have in a job interview that will predict if I'm going to be successful, right? That's just like um, correlation. That's not causation. And I think the problem is, as you can imagine, that if you have, one of a kind of people in the job, that maybe you will start looking for their facial expressions, right? So first of all, it's not valid. So it's not find anything that is actually predictive of success. And secondly, you might actually discriminate. So I think that strikes me as like problematic. Is it a good idea to take all kinds of data in, or I actually would say that maybe sort of traditional old school ways where you actually are in charge of the inputs when you do an algorithmic test or an assessment might be better because you actually know what you're testing for. And not just take any data. We see this in resume screeners too, right? Like you take all the data in, the tool does what it does best. It does a statistical analysis, and in some cases that are found out, found out that like first names like Thomas were predictive of success. Obviously, it has nothing to do with the job, but and then it went into like places like Syria and Canada were suddenly predictors of success. So that could be discrimination based on national origin, right? Like the word African American, those are things that everyone in hiring knows, like, this is like, you're on the path of discrimination and you definitely don't want to go there. But I think if we don't supervise these systems and monitor them, this can easily creep in. So I encourage everyone to do like pilot studies to really do their due diligence on these tools. But you also have to monitor them after you start using them, right? Because, the algorithm changes and the input data changes every time with new job seekers, new people who are successful in the job, you put their resumes in. So you have to constantly monitor the system. And I think that takes a lot of money, takes a lot of time. And I think a lot of talent acquisition HR departments buy these tools to save money. So it's sort of like they probably don't want to hire now people that now supervise these systems, but I think actually you kind of have to.
I, you raise an excellent point in that regard. Pretend I'm a CHRO or that I'm talking to a bunch of HR professionals, right? What kind of concrete steps do you think the employers can take, especially in the space of recruitment and hiring, right, and employee selection? What are the kind of things that you think they might do to kind of tweak their hiring processes to allow for that natural evaluation, that consistent feedback loop, that responsible use, right?
Everyone needs to put their critical thinking hat on, first of all, and really understand, like, what's my problem that I want to solve and what could be a solution. And then really critically assess these tools and really think through, like, well, is there science to actually back this up, this idea that this company is putting forward? And then do a pilot study. And then just like continuously, like there is a way, if we use deep neural networks, we can go back to the computer and the software and ask the software, what did you actually predict on? So you can get these lists, I mean, obviously thousands of keywords or something like that in case of a resume parser. It's not interesting to look at these lists, but it has to be done to just make sure it works, right? Like also, like if you buy a tool from a vendor, I think, if that company doesn't have a technical report, it's a first red
Mhm.
flag, right? And then really scrutinize these technical reports. I've only seen a few, and that does bug me a little bit because I think that should be actually public. Like if you built this tool and you validated it and you made sure that it, passes the 4/5 rule, and, it doesn't, it passed people at somewhat equal rates. Like, why wouldn't you make that public? I'm not understanding why that could be public. Um, and so a couple times that I was able to see it, I was like, wait a second, like some of these tools are validated on like college students in their 20s. Like, well, what happened to all the other people? How on earth can this be generalizable? Obviously, the vendor doesn't want, it be known if there's a problem, right? But like, I also feel like employers are kind of shy who use the tool. And I've talked to so many now who've used some of these tools for years, and then they're like, oh yeah, we have the same concerns that you outline in the book, and we had the same problem. So we like quietly abandon it. And that's good for that company. But like the whole community is none the wiser, right? And the next company, the next HR department will then buy the software again and again. Like, I do think that like AI is a great promise. Like, I have built AI tools for journalists. I use AI all the time, but I really think about the use case, and I really think through like, is this like an ethical use? Does this actually work? Does it discriminate?
We've done such a good job of educating the average consumer on the importance of reliability and validity, but we haven't gone that extra step. And then this is just my one man's opinion, right? But we haven't gone that extra step to say valid and reliable for what?
Yeah, and you don't want it just to work for a few. And I really do worry about like people with disabilities. In one of the games that I play to find like my sort of personality or my capabilities, I had to hit like the space bar as fast as possible to build up a bar. And while you're doing that, I was wondering, like, first of all, about like face validity, right? I was like, what does it have to do with any kind of job? Why am I hitting the space bar as fast as possible on my keyboard? But then when I played it with somebody who had a motor disability, like he was really concerned. Like, what is with people who can use their hands as fast as others? Like, will they be rejected? That's obviously like a very sort of basic example. But it's also like a question about these tools are quantitative tools that look for like the statistical medium, like most people together, what the middle has in common that is statistically relevant. So the problem is like people with disabilities are already underrepresented in the workforce. So they're probably not part of the training data or underrepresented in the training data that we use to train these tools. Well, and then on top of that, their disabilities are presenting themselves so individually, right? So maybe you have somebody who's autistic who plays the game, and hopefully somehow their data will be somehow statistically relevant. So that's already a high bar. But then the next person who is autistic, like their disability can present itself so differently. So it doesn't, this statistical analysis doesn't catch people on the margins, and especially people who've already been marginalized because they never make it into the training data. Then what's also troubling is like, yes, people can ask for an accommodation, but obviously people with disabilities don't necessarily want that because they're afraid of getting on, this imagined pile B that no one will be looking at, right? The people with disabilities on this pile B. But I think also the problem is with some of these tools, like the job seekers don't even know that they're being assessed by AI. They play a game. They have no idea what comes in the game. Like they don't even know if they're going to need an accommodation, right? So I think there's a lot of questions here. How can this work for people who are in sort of marginalized groups? And I was really sad and disappointed when I was working on an audit, and an auditor checked one of the video games companies for the 4/5 rule and found that in the intersection, when they checked for African American women, they found that they didn't at uh, pass at similar rates. They were below the 4/5 rule, and that didn't make it into the final audit because the company paid for the audit. So I would be very careful if I was an employer using a tool that has been audited by a third party to really understand, like, was there a conflict of interest?
One of the things that strikes me is even in your book, you talked a little bit about things outside the realm of recruitment, selection, and so on. And you talked a little bit about performance monitoring, evaluation, some of the stock kind of core bread and butter of what makes good talent optimization real. And that's naturally part of the world of human resources, as you might imagine. I'd love to hear some examples of the discrimination you found, and also, what it is that you see employers doing or could be doing in some way.
this one woman described to me how she like set a timer to go to the bathroom because she only had 15 minutes. And if she needed longer in the bathroom, she also wanted to eat a quick snack, but she needed to be back because as soon as she was over her 15-minute limits, her boss would like, call her, email her and be like, where are you? Like, you need to be working. And she described it as so stressful. And it really took, her mental health took a nosedive. And, we also know this from science, right? That like if we, the surveillance of workers is actually not leading to them being more productive. What it leads to is like productivity theater that, you try to like always have the green bar on, like the active status that you like check it early on Slack and we like ready to work at like 7:30 and then you take your dog for a walk. Or you go to meetings that you don't even you need to go to, but you just want to show your face. And that cannot be helpful in the workplace. So I think what is like a much, much better measurement, probably much harder. So like we can technically check if you're in front of your computer, but are you actually performing the work and are successful at doing the work? We don't actually know that. In fact, a lot of people just sit at the computer and do other things. Or just think around and honestly, I tested that myself and, surveilled myself and monitored myself with a couple of these companies. And, a lot of things that I do is like phone calls and other things that were like zero productive under their measurement standards, which I do think is essential to my job. But, obviously that can be tweaked. But I think, it has a really human toll. And I think there is like sort of a weird discrepancy here that we see a lot of CEOs saying, like in the age of AI, we need creative humans, critical thinking, like find new ways to think through problems. And it's sort of like, but at the same time, you're going to monitor every keystroke and take screenshots of my face and I'm really at my computer. That doesn't feel like you want me to be creative or, be a critical thinker and a team worker. And, we really need to think through like, how can we measure success? And I think we've seen that again and again, right? Like a company that I write about that did key swipe data to understand who they should promote. So who was the longest in the office should be promoted. It's already pretty flawed, right? Because you can be in the office and not be productive. But when it came time to layoffs during the pandemic, they also wanted to use this data and lay off the people that had the least hours in the office. Well, here you're the problem again, that it could be, people with disabilities, caregivers have longer absentee times in their protected classes.
I have an example for you that I think is arguably one of the weirdest ones I've ever come across in just studying this area a little bit, especially as far as it relates to performance monitoring. I worked with a company in particular that was trying to understand how ingenuity worked its way into their workforce, and more importantly, how the culture fostered it. And one of the things that they asked people were, have you ever purchased a mouse jiggler? At
Mhm.
knowing there is this keystroke and this mouse click technology out there, and that we're employing it. Have you actually used it? And people who had and done so were actually not scored negatively, but actually scored positively, right? But again, how do you know what the algorithm is? What is the right way to respond to that?
Yeah, and I think 'cause sometimes I do wonder, like, we want the easy ways, right? So we have understood, I think at one point there was this idea that if you used a particular browser, you are more intelligent than the general population. Well, that's not true for everyone. And also, like, why don't you just check for intelligence versus a browser? Like, that seems to be like a very bad proxy. And I mean, I talked to the former head of talent acquisition at Walmart, and I'm always like baffled, like where problems can come in from what different sides. Like they did a survey of people, and they found out, retention is a big deal, right? Like the people who stay longer at the stores, the associates, they often do so because they know somebody at the store. Seems totally facially neutral. But it turns out when they looked at the demographics, people who are Asian American have more acquaintances at the store and stay longer. And if they would have used this indicator, they would have discriminated essentially against African Americans, so had less connections to people in the store.
Yeah, it's funny. You really are hitting upon the theme of the show, which is it's AI plus HI, right? It
Yes.
takes both things to really make it effective. I'd love to hear your thoughts around, like, what are you seeing out there that really are the risks that might be there, the possible gains that might be there as well? around employee culture and employee morale, well-being, satisfaction, those kinds of
Yeah,
things.
yeah. I mean, I think, I think most employees are not against AI. They want to use AI as well, right? But they want to know how it's used to sort of supervise them in a way, or monitoring them, right? So, and I think if it's about safety, if you were monitoring in like a nuclear power plant, if you're monitoring my exposure with AI to nuclear materials, everyone is going to say yes to that, right? Because they want to be kept safe. So I think those are pretty easy things. But I think even employees are, if they understand this is a business necessity, I think they're willing to go with that, unless it's like, sort of all out surveillance. I think no one likes it. I think if you bring employees together and they have a say in this, I think there can be like great co-governance in using these tools and sort of really understanding how can we use them? How did the company assess it? You can actually build trust and transparency in your organization, which I think will greatly benefit the culture versus like a top-down. I always wonder, like, what happens when employees find out that you're doing this? Are they going to be happy or not? If they're not going to be happy, you might lose them. They might go somewhere else. And I don't know if you want that, because hiring seems to be very expensive. It's really hard to find the right people. So if you have good people in place, like, I would try to keep them.
Yeah. It's fascinating because that's actually what happens in many cases is I think many organizations are evaluating their talent processes on efficiency metrics as opposed to quality
Yeah.
metrics in some cases. And so you start to see some of those things. I find that the most refined organizations in the world are actually doing both, right? They're capturing both. So they're trying to figure out what throughput is in terms of their talent, but also trying to figure out how they optimize that talent.
So sometimes I wonder about some of these success metrics in hiring. I speak to recruiters, and they get paid how quickly they hire people. I mean, I get you want to speed that up, but I do feel like, wait, wouldn't you want to pay them if it's the right person? Did the person stay for a year and actually get a good performance review or something? Can you pay a recruiter 2/3 of their pay at the beginning and then a third after a year if that person actually turned out to be a good performer? Like, can we change the incentives here? I know it'd be harder, but I feel like, is that a good incentive for recruiters to just hire how fast they hire people? That cannot be. That just gets you, the people who are most likely to be hired. I will find those and sort of work with them. But if I'm really thinking through, like, who would be the most, the best qualified person for the job, I don't know. So I think there can be really things that can be changed.
One of the things that stands out is eh, what you've talked about is actually not an anti-AI perspective, but rather an AI perspective that is both monitored and used responsibly with the involvement of human intelligence and human evaluation, right? Uh, all of that rests on sort of a foundation of transparency, accountability, and even regulation to some
Yeah.
degree. What kind of practices can employers do both to put in place more internal accountability, but then at the same time also kind of foster greater transparency with their workforces?
So I do think we need more regulation. But I do think regulation is tough, because we've seen, for example, New York City Law 144, and I think that everyone agrees, from employers to vendors to experts and advocates, that it's kind of a disappointment that it really didn't work. And I think that's not good. Like, we can't have regulation that doesn't work, but regulation is really tough because there's so many use cases, so many different ways. So I think, like, transparency is better. Explainability is better if we can have employers sort of give that to candidates. That would also really help me as journalists and others to, like, piece together, how do these algorithms work. And I'm always down for finding good use cases and finding ways that this works. And so I hope that, like, the industry can maybe regulate itself a little better and have, like, higher standards. Maybe also, like, add to the 4/5 rule and actually look at, like, intersectionality and recommend that. So, yeah. And I do hope that, sometimes I hope maybe unions will start putting some of these AI tools into their bargaining contracts, so that employers need to be more transparent. And there is, there is accountability built in.
If there was one word, right, that you could use to kind of offer a piece of guidance and advice to your CEO, your CTO, and your CHRO, in terms of really integrating AI into talent, what is it that you would offer?
I would think about like transparency and explainability. Can you, I do this a lot when I talk to vendors. I always ask, like, if you were in front of a judge and, I usually take all these tests. So I've done so many AI video interviews and games and all of this. And I was like, can you tell me how exactly I was scored? How did the 89% come together? If you can explain that to me, that's a problem.
It's fascinating. You sort of hit upon something that stands out even in terms of explainability and taking all those games, right? So really with the aim of explainability, but more importantly, explainability and then repeatability,
Oh
right?
God,
I'd love,
yeah. Oh, we saw so many problems
yeah,
with some of these tools. Like they couldn't repeat the same thing, and it's like they're so brittle.
yeah.
I mean, that is so flawed that they shouldn't be even on the market. And I don't know if they can be out regulated, but I think we just assume, like, we all always assume that, like, oh, it's on the market, so somebody must have tested it. But no, that's actually not the case. Nobody has to test these tools; they can just exist.
I need to thank you. I have to be honest. This has been such a joy, Hilke. And honestly, I want to thank you for sharing your experiences, your deep insights with us. This has been so great, and I'm truly grateful. For our listeners, if you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to comment, leave a review, etc., whatever you think is critical. And then finally, if you can find all our episodes on our website or want to find them, please go to sherm.org/AIHI. Thanks for joining the conversation, Hilke. We've really appreciated your time here today. And thank you all for joining our conversation here today. And we'll catch you next time on the AI+HI project.